And today we're going to start on subtitle B, Improving America's Moral Standing in the World, which I guess sort of leads the question, what is America's moral standing in the world? How does the rest of the world see us? And it's easy for us as Americans to think back to World War II as us being kind of the heroes and saving the world kind of thing. In the decades and decades since, we've gotten involved in a number of other foreign wars. Our international relationships have varied. And so where are we today? Well, the reason for this section is because there are opportunities where our moral standing is not very good and needs improvement. And today we're going to talk about our use of economic sanctions and our support for the Saudi Arabia's war against Yemen. So Section 331 would restrict the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. What are economic sanctions? Essentially, this is sort of cutting people off from the marketplace and saying that you can't buy or sell with this country. In a presentation on sanctions last fall, Margaret Flowers defined them as unilateral coercive economic measures. And so I think it's important to emphasize that word unilateral, right? If I say if the IRS is going to freeze your bank account or something like that, you can take them to court. You have some sort of appeal process. And when we talked about civil asset forfeiture, if you get stopped on the side of the road and somebody takes the law enforcement takes all your money, they give you a receipt and you can try and win it back. The sanctions that we put on other countries are unilateral. There's no appeal. There's no due process. This is the United States saying, sorry, we're going to cut you off from world markets. And so because when they're targeted against individuals, that's one thing. But when they are targeted against an entire country, they are a form of collective punishment. For civilians, economic violence can be even more deadly than military force. If you look at North Korea, for example, the people there are more malnourished. They're physically shorter than their relations in South Korea as a result of being cut off from world markets. Our U.S. sanctions against places like Iran, seeing this now with Russia, they're devaluing their currency, which leads to inflation and impacts family budgets across a nation. And economic sanctions are sort of like a reverse universal basic income. Those with the least get hurt the most. According to the website sanctionskill.org, the United States is currently imposing sanctions on Afghanistan, Belarus, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Burundi, Central African Republic, the People's Republic of China, Comoros, Crimea region of Ukraine, Cuba, Cyprus, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, North Korea, Palestinian territories, Russia, Rwanda, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Venezuela, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Some 40 countries representing a huge part of the world's population are being hurt and hit by our economic sanctions. Even if we don't actually sanction a country, before we put sanctions on Venezuela, for example, they were designated a national security threat. And when you do that, it puts international businesses on notice that this country could be next. Like, this is a country you probably don't want to do business with. You could imagine, if you've read in the newspaper that you were being investigated for something that maybe your employer might not want to be associated with you anymore. And so we do that to other countries around the world. In the case of Venezuela, the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. released a report in 2019 looking at the harm that our sanctions there have caused. and concluded that more than 40,000 civilian deaths could be attributed to our sanctions against that country. One of the things that we do is Venezuela, for example, is an oil-rich country, and by blocking them from selling their oil to U.S. companies, we disrupt the income of the nation and make it that much harder for the people in the country to meet their basic needs, to buy the things that they need on the world market. A couple other quick examples. We complain about the gridlock in Congress, but some of the things that they are still getting done is putting together to put sanctions on countries like Nicaragua. Last year on November 1st, the Senate passed S 1064, the Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to Conditions for Electoral Reform Act of 2021. And you're probably thinking, wait, what does that mean? Are we trying to tell Nicaragua how they should run their elections? And the answer is yes. We're punishing the country if we don't like the way that their elections are run. The Senate passed that on November 1st, and on November 3rd, the House did too. And you're probably thinking, wait, 2 days, was that really enough time for Congress to give it due deliberation and be sure what they're doing? No, it just flew right through, and a week later it was on the president's desk and signed into law. Cuba, we've had a blockade, we've had sanctions against Cuba since John F. Kennedy was president for 60 years. Like 5 out of 6 people that live in Cuba now weren't even alive when this started. And yet we continue to restrict trade with the entire nation of Cuba. And this does not make us look good to the rest of the world. Since 1992, the United Nations they've introduced resolutions recognizing the quote, necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Last June, for the 29th time in a row, the United Nations adopted this resolution by a vote of 184 in favor, 2 against. We don't look very good to the rest of the world when we throw our economic weight around and use it to push around small countries like this. Mexico, last summer, Cuba had protests. Mexico wanted to send supplies, and they couldn't get any commercial carrier to send humanitarian assistance because then that commercial carrier could be penalized by the United States. They had to use a naval vessel to bring humanitarian supplies to Cuba. And so Section 331 of the Blueprint for a Better America will restrict the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit on this one. So I'm going to share my screen and we can look at the legislation and the law itself. On the left-hand side, we've got the Section 331, and on the right is the section of U.S. code that is being amended. And so these are economic sanctions that are relating to Iran. And right now we have sanctions prohibiting on imports and prohibiting exports. So basically, no good or service of Iranian origin can be imported into the United States or exported. Sometimes I hire people on Upwork. It's a popular service for providing. You can hire freelancers and things like that. I can't hire anyone from Iran. I can't be employed by anyone from Iran because of a section of law. So subsection A would repeal both of those, and as well as the regulatory authority that would allow the president to create an exemption, the paragraphs that are being deleted. That's subsection A of section 331. After that, we get into the rest of the bill amends chapter 79 of Title 22. And these are the sections that deal with trade sanctions. And so subsection B creates a new definition. It adds a new definition of unilateral economic sanction. And that would mean any prohibition, restriction, or condition on non-specific imports or exports with respect to a foreign country or foreign entity that is imposed by the United States. And then there are exemptions for if we're part of a multilateral regime and we're doing this as a group effort, or it's part of a mandatory decision by the United Nations. Subsection C, we're going to go ahead and start putting these restrictions into place. Where we already have restrictions that are supposed to stop the United States from imposing agricultural sanctions or medical sanctions, we would add unilateral economic sanctions to those provisions as well. It would also require that when any sanction is proposed, that it describe a current action by the foreign country or foreign entity to make sure that countries aren't being penalized for things that previous generations have done. And this would also terminate any unilateral sanctions that are in place as of effect, that are in effect as of October 30th, 2022. There are exemptions in the current law for sponsors of international terrorism, and those exemptions do stay in place. The provisions for the state sponsors of international terrorism, those exemptions go away, and there's the same restriction on unilateral economic sanctions for any country. 7207 relates to prohibition on United States assistance and financing, and this stops and discourages businesses from trading with various countries. And unless it's part of a United Nations declaration or part of some sort of international coalition, we should keep our thumb off the scales in the international marketplace when it comes to civilian populations. And the last subsection of this here on the left, this would amend Section 208 of Title 22 to be very clear that this chapter shall be construed to nullify the existing prohibitions and blockade of Cuba. And so after more than six decades, we can fix that policy. And our neighbor to the south, we can once again be trying to improve our relationships with our neighbors. So, well, with that, Mixed Chair, I believe that concludes my testimony on Section 331.
Thank you. I do have a question. So while I agree with you generally that the United States does not have strong moral ground to stand on, oftentimes or maybe not even oftentimes, but sometimes economic sanctions are used as a way to sort of almost punish another country, or if a country is doing something that the world generally sees as negative, whether it is harming their own civilians or harming people in another country. If economic sanctions are not a humane way to try to address those problems, what other avenues do we have to try to affect how those nation states are acting?
Part of it probably depends on the specifics when you say acting, whether it's the way that they're acting in their own country. They're just have the audacity to elect leadership that we don't approve of. Well, sorry, it's not our country. We don't get to tell other countries how they run their elections and who they are, and we don't get to decide who they elect as their leaders. You talked about how economic sanctions could be effective, but when you do that, you're acknowledging that they're a collective punishment, that you're punishing the entire country for something that the entire country isn't doing, but you're punishing everyone, and collective punishments are prohibited under the United Nations Charter. Did that answer your question, or were you looking? If you can give me more of a specific example?
Yeah, not necessarily disagreeing on the stance of ending economic sanctions, or that sanctions are harmful. I don't think that they are helpful. I agree with you. I think that they are often a net negative. But when we see, for example, a very recent modern example is Russia invading Ukraine, this is something that the world at large is mostly against, but many countries, including the United States, are considering economic sanctions against Russia, which I personally believe would be more hurtful than helpful. I don't think that's going to do much to affect the invasion, but it will negatively affect the innocent people of Russia, and many innocent Russians. But I'm wondering, how then should we approach those kinds of instances, and not just the United States, but countries in general with international relations, when we see behavior like this that is just kind of generally denounced worldwide, that is hurting many people. What might be some other avenues that we could use to try to address those situations?
To talk about Russia, right, is we are using targeted sanctions. We're not cutting off the entire nation, right? So targeted sanctions would not be restricted by this section. It only deals with unilateral nationwide sanctions. Second thing is that there's also exemptions in there for if you're part of a multilateral coalition or part of a UN thing. The restriction here in Section 331 is about the United States unilaterally saying we're going to punish this entire country. It's part of a larger coalition. Without endorsing it, I would say that it wouldn't be prohibited under Section 331.
Thanks. And we do have another question here. What about Cuban cigars? Are they illegal?
Yes, they are. You're not allowed to import anything from Cuba. You're not allowed to anything that has passed through Cuba. It's a pretty restrictive blockade on Cuba. Apparently, there was a narrow exemption for personal use. President Obama created, and then it only lasts about 4 years, and President Trump removed the exemption. So, yes, if you have a Cuban cigar, you are in violation of United States law.